You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
This episode is brought to you by PBS, home of Ken Burns. Ken Burns' films aren't just documentaries, they're national events, and his latest, The American Revolution, is the one you've been waiting for. When you think American Revolution, you probably picture tea crates in Boston Harbor, founders signing documents in Philadelphia, redcoats marching into battle. But Ken Burns, along with Sarah Botstein and David Schmidt, take us so much deeper. This was a revolution that was bloody, complicated, and unbelievably consequential. It's a story of people, some you know and many you don't, who risked everything to change the course of history. Their fight for independence lit a spark for freedom that still burns today. George Washington called it the cause of mankind, and John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail, "Posterity, you will never know what it cost us to preserve your freedom." With the American Revolution, Ken Burns and his team bring us a story that's vast, human, and deeply relevant, a story that belongs to all of us. Stream The American Revolution on the PBS app. I can't wait to give it a watch.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon Prime. Black Friday Game Day on Prime is an epic day of live sports. It all starts at 9 a.m. Eastern with the Capital One Skins game. Then, Black Friday football returns when the Bears take on the Eagles at 3 p.m. And it culminates with the final night of Emirates NBA Cup Group play with Bucks-Knicks at 7 p.m. and Mavs-Lakers at 10 p.m. Black Friday Game Day, only on Prime.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 241, North Africa 1940, Operation Compass. This week, a big thank you goes out to Georgetta for supporting the podcast by becoming a member. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast's episodes, plus special member-only episodes released roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. During the second week of December 1940, the first major British offensive in North Africa during the Second World War would begin. Its goal was to attack against a series of Italian fortified camps that the Italians had constructed in the aftermath of their own attack from the Libyan border to Sidi Barrani. The opening phases of the attack would be successful beyond anything that the British had hoped for, and in fact the attack was so successful that the objectives were extended out beyond what was originally planned. The early parts of the First World War, for the British, are full of instances where they would launch attacks that would be far less successful than they hoped, and this would be the opposite. Because before the attack began, Wavell would write to London and say, quote, "I'm not entertaining extravagant hopes of this operation, but I do wish to make certain that if a big opportunity occurs, we are prepared morally, mentally, and administratively to use it to its fullest." End quote. In this case, they would need to be prepared for those opportunities because they would be presented with a very big one. But as with all desert offensives early in the war years, there were logistical limits to what could be accomplished, and as the British outran their supplies in the aftermath of their attacks on the fortified camps, they would begin to have serious challenges. These challenges would only be encountered after the opening phases of the attack, though, which will be our focus for this episode today. For the beginning of Operation Compass, the British were able to bring together the 7th Armored and 4th Indian Divisions. The total manpower was about 36,000, at least for those that would be actively committed to the offensive. Both of the divisions had been built up to their establishment strength in the weeks before the attack was launched, which was different than months earlier when they were far below establishment. Along with the two divisions, there were several important pieces that would be considered core-level assets that were also committed to the attack, including artillery and 48 Matilda infantry support tanks. These resources would be critical, given the nature of the Italian positions and the task that was being asked of the attack, which was to assault those prepared Italian camps, where the artillery and armor would be invaluable. As discussed last episode, the Matildas were mostly safe from anything that the Italians had to use against them, unless they were unlucky enough to be hit by a large artillery shell or run over an anti-tank mine. The one major downside of the Matildas, their slow speed, would not be a huge problem for the attack on the camp since they were completely stationary. The Italians were able to bring more resources to bear than the attackers, more soldiers. But critically, those resources were spread out along the front instead of being concentrated like the British units were. The Italian units could also not easily be shifted from one camp to another while combat was ongoing. They were pretty much stuck in the camp they were in, which presented the British with the ability or the opportunity to defeat each of the Italian formations in detail, which is exactly what they planned to do. Extreme measures were taken to try and maintain the secrecy in the weeks and months before the attack. Leaks were a major concern for the British leaders due to the known presence of many Italian intelligence assets within Egypt, and this prompted the decision that nothing about the attack would be committed to paper until just a few days before the attack was scheduled to begin. Many of the long-running preparations were explained away for other reasons. For example, the creation of forward supply dumps was simply explained as efforts made to bolster British defensive capabilities, which was not a bad lie. It could also be that, instead of just an offensive. There were certain preparations for which no excuse could be found, and so in many cases the decision was made to simply not do some typical tasks. For example, the medical services were not notified and prepared to accept the expected casualties during the attack before the attack began, a clear sacrifice on the altar of secrecy. These efforts put into keeping the attack secret would end up paying off once it started. Although interestingly enough, one of the downsides of all this secrecy is that the general in charge of leading the attack, General O'Connor, was not even told necessarily of the possible scope of the attack if it went well. The original plan that he had been told was for a quick raid that would not take more than a few days. But then only days before the start date for the attack, he learned that if things went well, he would be expected to continue the attack forward, further west and away from his supplies. This completely changed what the preparations should have been for the attack, but by the beginning of December, it was too late to change the course of those preparations. As the final written orders began to be distributed, various units along the front began to learn of the part that they would play in the coming offensive, and they also began to move into position. One of the first units to get the final orders for the attack was the 7th Royal Tank Regiment, which was equipped with some of those Matildas. They had to have early warning because it would take time for them to move to the front, arrive at a supply depot to replenish supplies, before then moving on to their final jumping off points. They would actually end up arriving near the front about 2 days before the attack began, giving them plenty of time not just to restock consumables, but also to get a bit of rest and a bit of maintenance on their tanks. On December 7th, all of the forces involved in the attack started moving, with the most important groups moving into position near the Inba Gap from where they would launch their attacks. Because of the limited roads in the area and the size of the British units involved, a tremendous amount of dust was created by the long lines of British troops on the move. In total, there were 5,000 vehicles moving about 100 kilometers, and the length of the columns of these vehicles was quite long, many kilometers in length actually, and that created a lot of dust. All along the front, though, they would stop at certain intervals to pull from pre-positioned field supply depots, which were put in place specifically to extend the range of the vehicles involved. These supplies were critical for some of the tanks, which had very short action ranges. There were Italian aircraft in the air, and at least one of them probably spotted the British units, but their report seems to have been ignored, or at the very least was not immediately acted upon. This would be one of many Italian intelligence errors during the offensive. As the clock approached midnight on December 8th, some units began moving towards their final jumping-off points. Over the following hours, some of the most critical units would advance out towards the Italian lines, with the 7th Royal Tank Regiment and their Matildas being among them, but also the 11th Infantry Brigade of the 4th Indian Division, which would move out into the Inba Gap to move into their attack positions to the south and west of the Nbewa camp. At the same time, RAF bombers focused their attacks on Nbewa in an effort to distract them and to distract the Italian defenders, with the goal of forcing them to keep their heads down and to prevent them from hearing the British columns as they advanced. For the Nbewa camp, the general plan for the British attack was for some units of the 7th Armored Division to move to the west of the camp to cut it off from the possibility of Italian reinforcements. This would be done by moving units of the 11th Hussars as far forward as possible before the attack so that they could quickly race to the Sidi Barani Solam road, which was used by the Italians to move forces around their fortified camps and to their fortified camps from further west. At the same time, the infantry tanks and the Indian infantry units would launch an attack directly into the camp, supported by heavy artillery. Throughout the early morning hours, the various units that would be involved in the assault would move into position, with the goal of attacking from multiple different angles simultaneously. Importantly, there was a gap in the minefields around the camp which had been identified before the attack, and it was through this gap that the majority of the armor support would pass. The artillery fire would begin at around 7 a.m. in the morning, with a maximum effort 10-minute barrage by guns primarily of the 4th Indian Division right before the attack. In the Italian camps, breakfast was generally served at around 7:30, and this meant that when the artillery started firing, some units were preparing for breakfast, while some were already getting ready to eat. The intensity of the artillery fire came as a serious shock to the Italian forces, and for many this was the first time that they had been on the receiving end of such a violent barrage. The Matildas then started moving forward at about 7:25 a.m., and at the time, the artillery fire from the British artillery looked quite impressive as it landed on the Italian positions. They would move forward with the intention of attacking the various Italian positions in their path, including several Italian tanks that were positioned on the southwest side of the camp. They would dispatch these quite quickly, and then they would move into the camp itself. There was simply nothing that the Italian forces could do against the British tanks, and so they were free to just continue to exist in the camp and use their machine guns against anything that moved. There were also instances of the tanks just physically destroying some Italian guns and defensive positions by running over them. This lasted for about 15 minutes, actually, before the British infantry joined in the attack, moving forward on tracked infantry carriers and trucks. By the time they arrived in the camp, the Italian defenses were in shambles, and the action more closely resembled a mopping up exercise rather than an actual attack. It only took about an hour for every Italian in Nabewa to either be killed or to surrender. For the Italians, it had been a complete disaster, with somewhere around 600 dead and almost 3,000 captured, and it had only cost the British around 56 total casualties, with the bulk of those suffering only light wounds. It could not have gone better for the British, really, or worse for the Italians. In retrospect, there might have been things that the Italians could have done to protect themselves better before the attack, more minefields, being better prepared to cover them with fire to prevent the easy movement of British forces. But in reality, the camp was taken almost completely by surprise, so it's unlikely that there was an easy change that could have been made to their preparations that would have changed the result. It's a great example of how important tactical surprise could be when attacking an enemy in a prepared defensive position. One thing of note was that while the Italian arms had not performed very well, apparently they had really good food. This comes to us from Alan Moorhead, a journalist that would be among the first group of civilians allowed into the Italian camp after its capture. He would later write that, quote, "We sat down on the open sand and ate from stores of bottled cherries, great tins of frozen hams and anchovies, bread that had been baked somewhere in the desert, and wines, red and white, and from the slopes of Vesuvius above Naples." End quote. The British forces would take advantage of this as well, and they would also rummage through the Italian stores and equipment and take anything that was useful. This included large items like trucks. They were always looking for more vehicles, which were invaluable no matter who made them, no matter what state they were in. If it could only run 10 miles, it was still great to have it for those 10 miles. But also there were many smaller items, with Italian aluminum water bottles apparently being highly sought after, with some of them being used even years later at the end of the North African campaign in 1943. This episode is brought to you by PBS, home of Ken Burns. Ken Burns' films aren't just documentaries, they're national events, and his latest, The American Revolution, is the one you've been waiting for. When you think American Revolution, you probably picture tea crates in Boston Harbor, founders signing documents in Philadelphia, redcoats marching into battle. But Ken Burns, along with Sarah Botstein and David Schmidt, take us so much deeper. This was a revolution that was bloody, complicated, and unbelievably consequential. It's a story of people, some you know and many you don't, who risked everything to change the course of history. Their fight for independence lit a spark for freedom that still burns today. George Washington called it the cause of mankind, and John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail, "Posterity, you will never know what it cost us to preserve your freedom." With the American Revolution, Ken Burns and his team bring us a story that's vast, human, and deeply relevant, a story that belongs to all of us. Stream the American Revolution on the PBS app. I can't wait to give it a watch.
With new, gentler scented Clorox disinfecting wipes, clean finally smells as good as it feels. On everything from lamps to ceiling fans, even on your kid's toy shark. Oh, ouch. Clorox disinfecting wipes, now available in crisp lemon. Find it on Amazon. Clorox, clean feels good.
While the destruction of Nabewa was underway, other British forces were on the move to the west in an effort to cut the road to the west that the Italians would have to travel on if they wanted to retreat. And up to the point where they got to the road, they experienced very little Italian resistance. They would actually reach the road at 9 a.m., at which point they would capture 8 Italian trucks that were carrying soldiers back to the west. The British would be forced to retreat a few minutes later, with the British armored cars that had reached the road coming under fire from a few Italian anti-tank guns. But even though they had to retreat, they were still serving their purpose of disrupting Italian traffic on the road. That was their goal. There were other British forces also on the move as well, with the 5th Indian Brigade, loaded up in trucks and other vehicles, moving past Nabewa on their way to attack the Italians at Tumar West, which was located to the north of the Italian camp at Nabewa. They would also be joined by as many Matildas as possible, although 6 of them would have to be left behind due to mechanical issues. The British plan for Tumar West was very similar to what they had done at Nabewa, at least partially because they were organized in a very similar way. There was an anti-tank ditch, a low wall with machine gun posts, and then the usual collection of Italian armor and artillery. At about 1:30 p.m., the artillery would begin firing on the camp, and the attack would move forward. On the Italian side, they were at least less surprised by the British attack at this second camp, with warnings having been sent out to all of the camps warning them of possible British attack. There were still the problems of the Matildas, though, who moved forward about 20 minutes before the infantry to begin their crawl of destruction for a second time during the day. There were some lucky shots in Tumar West from Italian anti-tank guns, which were able to use their high muzzle velocities to jam Matilda turrets if shells hit in exactly the right spot. But the damage that was done did nothing to diminish the firepower of the tank. It just made it a bit more difficult to use that firepower because they couldn't traverse the turret. The tanks were able to destroy gun after gun, both artillery guns and anti-tank guns, even if it was a slightly slower process. The infantry would then join in the attack about 20 minutes after the tanks had entered the camp. They were actually quite surprised by the stout Italian defense at Tumar West, because unlike at Nabewa, where the Italians were completely disorganized, at Tumar West they had been able to man and prepare their perimeter defenses, which were not completely destroyed by the tank attack. This meant that when the infantry did move forward, they found themselves under fire from both infantry and machine guns. The Italian positions were neutralized, one right after another though, because without the ability to answer the Matildas in some way, the Italian defenses would only be able to hold out so long before they were destroyed. At about 4 p.m., just a few hours after the start of the attack, the final resistance inside of Tumar West was extinguished. A final effort was made against Tumar East as well, which was, as you guessed it, to the east of Tumar West. But by the time the tanks got rolling with the available infantry, the exhaustion of all involved was clear. The attack would be called off shortly after it began, but it would not actually end up mattering because the garrison at Tumar East would surrender to the British the next day. Importantly, for any future British efforts, the attacks on the 3 camps had caused almost all of the Matildas to be put out of action, not really because of anything the Italians did, but simply due to mechanical issues. Only 10 of the original 47 would be available for action at the end of the day, although frantic efforts would begin to bring more back into the fight for the next day of fighting. After the neutralization of the two camps at Tumar, the next target for the British attack was Sidi Barrani, which was further to the north and along the coast. This would be the target of the 4th Armored Brigade, which was already moving as the camps were being attacked. On the Italian side, Garibaldi, the commander of all Italian forces in Egypt, was in a very difficult position. The camps were clearly lost, and while he did have a mobile reserve, it was over 100 kilometers away to the west, and was not really equipped or ready to meet the British armored units in battle. While this was a problem, the greater problem was simply that there were so many British units essentially wandering around behind Italian lines. This made it incredibly hard not just to defeat them and drive them off, but just to put together a coherent defense. Garibaldi quickly came to the conclusion that the only option available was to start pulling back any forces that could possibly retreat, because if they didn't, they would be cut off and surrounded and eventually forced to surrender. But before this retreat could be ordered, the British were already attacking Sidi Barrani, threatening to cut off all of the Italian forces that were still to the east. The attack was launched on the morning of December 10th, even though the bulk of the British artillery and heavier tanks had not yet arrived. This meant that the attack was mostly just launched by infantry and trucks and some light reconnaissance vehicles. This was due to the decision made by the commander on the scene, Brigadier General Lomax of the 16th British Brigade. Well, he made the decision that speed was more important than preparation, given the previous attacks and the possibility that the Italians were using any available time to bolster their defense and to evacuate more forces to the east. This decision almost led to disaster, because as the infantry got moving, and when they'd covered about half the distance to the Italian lines, the fog that they had been using to cover their movement from Italian artillery began to dissipate. Immediately, the Italian artillery began firing and hitting many of the infantry trucks. The infantry dismounted and tried to find what cover that they could, but there was little hope in the attack at that point. They would be saved, as so many other British infantry had been saved during the first few days of Compass, by the arrival of the Matildas. In this case, 10 Matildas, which immediately moved in to attack the Italian artillery. This decisively swung the battle in the favor of the British, and the previously pinned down and helpless infantry moved in to attack. While they were moving forward, it rapidly became apparent that some of the garrison quickly wanted to surrender instead of resist. But that did not mean that the fighting was over, and it would continue for most of the afternoon as the British attackers slowly ground down the defenses. By the end of December 10th, with Sidi Barrani in British hands, it was clear that Compass, almost without exception, had been an incredible success. During the fighting over the course of the 3 days, they had captured Nabewa, the 2 Tumar camps, and Sidi Barrani. Along with these positions, they had also captured around 20,000 Italian troops. There were also almost 200 Italian artillery guns and 60 tanks that had been captured. More importantly, they had compromised the Italian positions in Egypt to such an extent that the Italian forces were frantically attempting to retreat. They were retreating so fast that the British had troubles cutting them off and keeping up with their movements. But often, when they did, many Italians would surrender as soon as the British came within gun range. This was mostly understandable, as it was difficult to see what purpose there would be in continuing to fight, and it was not like they could easily continue to retreat across the desert without access to supplies. This caused the number of prisoners to grow in the days that followed, with the British Colonel Alec Gatehouse writing, quote, "No defeated enemy has ever cooperated with its opponents to the extent that the Italians did on this day. They assembled their own lorries, refueled them with their own fuel, and drove them full of their own prisoners to Matilda, and they came back for more, all without escort of any kind." End quote. For most of these troops, the war would be over. For the guns and vehicles captured during this time, the war was far from over, and the British units would put most of them to work to replace British vehicles that had been damaged in action or had been written off due to mechanical issues. It's possible that over 1,000 vehicles of all types were captured by the British during this attack, but it is difficult to get an exact count because one thing that is clear is that some British units would not make accurate reports in the hopes that they could hold on to the vehicles for longer. Also, many of those captured vehicles would then later be lost, either to enemy action or further mechanical issues in the days and weeks that followed, although the British troops would put them to good use in the meantime. These vehicles would be critical because Operation Compass, which had originally started out as a 5-day raid with the goal of neutralizing the camps and moving on Sidi Barrani, was suddenly repurposed. Instead of stopping the attack after the objectives were achieved, the plan was greatly expanded, and soon every British vehicle that could move was chasing the retreating Italians on their way west and towards the Libyan border.